First of all, I want to welcome everybody as they come on, and again, the time that people are taking to engage with us today. So honored and so appreciative. And I think it would go without saying that I want to call out sort of the elephant in the room, or the donkey in the room, or whatever animal the libertarians have. I'm not quite sure what that might be. And I want to say, here we are, the day after, in the U.S., the day after an election that seemed to go on for quite a long time. It was very emotional. It was very volatile in many aspects. People had different reactions to it, and the way they process it. It seems like every 4 years it gets longer and longer in terms of the cycle. So here we are, folks. Here we are the day after. And we are dealing with the reactions of everything. Some people are very satisfied and very content and happy with the results. Some people might be very disappointed, discouraged, or sad. Just like anything else in life, events happen. And this happens to us on a national scale, or it can happen on an individual scale. And I just want to say a couple things around that, and that is, as you go through today and as you really kind of reconcile whatever your reaction is, you have an opportunity, as we go through the information, to find and use your voice for positive good, for positive output, for a positive outcome. That's what my whole book is about, is to find your voice as a leader, no matter where you are in your life, no matter what role you're in. So it's very appropriate as we've concluded the election cycle, as we take this sort of mindful moment for today and the next few weeks before our next administration begins here in the U.S., to really say, what can I do? How can I influence things? And where you can start today is something I'm also talking with some of my clients about today from an executive coaching perspective. Social media is alive right now. And as we know, a lot of us are engaged with social media, whether it be the Facebooks, the Snapchats, the Instagrams, the Twitters, the LinkedIns, traditional email, traditional texting, whatever we might use. I want to call to action for all of you on the call here today, that before you actually post something, before you actually react to something, before you actually communicate anything, take a second. Be very mindful of the purpose of what you're saying. Be very mindful of the outcome that you want to have, and thus be very deliberate in terms of what you say or how you react or what you write down or what you even dialogue, no matter what the form of communication is. Everything is on a heightened state of awareness today. You just turn on the TV, you turn on the radio, whatever media you use, we're just blaring. You add into that the fatigue that we are all feeling today, the fatigue of 18 or 19 months of an election cycle, and the fatigue of last night, which seemed to go on forever. You add all that up, people can say things today that they may not always mean. They can say things today that can have an unintended consequence. And I just want to say that in your role as a leader, because all of you lead, no matter where you are in your life, be very deliberate with how you communicate. Be very deliberate with your purpose of what you communicate. And more importantly, and we need this now more than ever, be very deliberate with the outcome and the positive outcome you want to have with how you communicate. And that's what I wanted to kind of call that out, because doing this webinar today is incredibly timely, but it also would be incredibly incredulous for me to talk about this and not call out where we are in the space of our history.
Well, thank you so much, Paul, for that coaching moment and for a chance to acknowledge the various feelings or thoughts that people are bringing to this hour. And I'm personally thrilled for the opportunity to hear from you today and be inspired anew about the positive difference we can each make as leaders. So as we begin, a couple of housekeeping items. We are looking for people to join us in live tweeting, and the chat window does have Paul's Twitter handle and our hashtag for today, Leader Voice, listed if you need to reference that in the chat window. We will be recording today's webinar, and we will also share a PDF of the slides in the follow-up email that I will send first thing tomorrow, and so you can be looking for that from me. We are going to take some questions at the end, and so I want to call out the question panel for those of you who have attended our webinars in the past. I hope that you'll add your questions throughout the presentation, and I'll be sharing those with Paul later. If you're new to this webinar, I would love to have you go ahead and try it out and tell me where you're calling in from. I'd love to, see the makeup of where people are calling in from, whether we have folks from around the world or across the country. Now, Paul, you're in California today,
Correct.
in the San Francisco area, and I'm here in the state of Michigan, and I imagine we have people from all sorts of places. So go ahead and try out that question panel and let us know where you're calling in from, and I'll give a shout out to you. It looks like wow, we have California, Chicago, Minneapolis, Birmingham, Alabama, Oregon, Florida, Toronto, Arizona, Philadelphia. We have a caller from Italy, Virginia, Georgia, Spokane, Washington, upstate New York, Orlando, Ontario, South Bend. Thank you so much to all of you who are investing this time. Someone from London on the call. So we are thrilled to have you. And as we transition to Paul's presentation, I want to take a quick moment to introduce him. Paul is a certified professional performance coach, and he has over 30 years business experience with small and large companies, including serving as the Chief Human Resources Officer for a $3 billion company. Now, my main comment, like, wow, impressive credentials, and you don't look old enough to have 30 years business experience.
It's Photoshop on the video, on the webcam.
Exactly. And I've enjoyed getting to know Paul, as my team and I have been supporting the launch of his latest book, Find Your Voice as a Leader, which is available on Kindle and in print. And currently Paul works doing executive and leadership coaching with teams at organizations like SAP and Twitter and Kaiser Permanente, and we're going to talk a bit more about that at the end of the call. But as you saw from our coaching moment at the start of this event, Paul has deep expertise and inspiration to share with us today. So Paul, welcome. I'm going to disappear, and I'll be back at the end to take questions. Please feel free to put those in the question panel throughout the event, and we look forward to the engagement and learning from you, Paul. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Becky. And I really appreciate the wonderful and eloquent introduction, the wonderful time and the framework for this hour that I can spend with folks. And for the next few minutes, kind of go over sort of my messaging of finding your voice as a leader. And regarding sort of my 30 years of experience, and the key to everything is to keep your hair really short, because then the gray doesn't show up quite as much. So that is a hint that I've gotten and that I've utilized very well. So Becky, thank you very much again for that wonderful compliment and for the introduction. And again, everybody, welcome. This is an incredible opportunity that I have to engage with all of you, and I hope our connections and so forth will continue on after this. And I want to talk to you today a little bit about how you find your voice as a leader. I think it's more important now than ever in my role as a coach, in my role that I have as a leadership facilitator, in the role that I have as a speaker, and actually, folks, in the role that we have as human beings. How do you find your voice and then use that voice for impact and what that looks like? Finding your voice is not about shouting louder, which sometimes is contradictory to everything that we go through in our media-intensive world. Finding your voice is being very purposeful and very deliberate with your actions, your decisions, and your communication. And that's what I really want to talk to you about today, is taking that voice model and talking a little bit more. So if we can go to the next slide, I'll be kind of directing the slides as we go through. For our next slide, and I want to use a question that I use quite a bit. So our next slide, there we go. Perfect, beautiful. Thank you so much, Lauren. I appreciate it. Leadership is a choice, not a position. It's one of my favorite quotes by the late Stephen Covey. Leadership is a choice, not a position. Now think about that for a second. And then I love to use the if-then conditional, which I use a lot in coaching when I'm working with groups and organizations, or I'm working with individual leaders and organizations, which is primarily what I do in my capacity. I like to use a lot of sort of the if-then sort of statements. So if leadership is a choice and not a position, then why do you choose to lead? And think about that for a second. No matter what role you're in, at an organization, in your family, as a parent, as a wife, as a husband, boyfriend, girlfriend, friends, no matter where you are, no matter the type of organization you're in, why do you choose to lead? Because we always choose to lead. We choose to lead on a daily, hourly, minute-by-minute basis, or we choose not to lead. And I want you to really think about, when do you choose to lead and why do you choose to lead? Because it's not about the position title, the job description. It really comes down to what motivates you. Why do you choose to lead? When I ask this question of sometimes the folks that I coach, many times I get sort of the blank stares. It's a question that sometimes they haven't actually thought about it. They've been sort of on automatic pilot through their career, and they've been very successful, and then they find themselves sort of in a role. But when I ask them, why are you actually leading? Why do you choose to be a leader? What is it about leading that really speaks to you? A lot of times they actually haven't had the chance to reflect on that. And that's where we begin sort of our coaching conversation, because that really is the essence of really finding your voice. If we can move to slide number 3, I'm going to talk a little bit more about, what is your leadership voice? What's that voice that you have? How do you build your legacy? Again, another question I ask right off the bat of leaders, a lot of times, whether it be in a coaching role or if I'm on an airplane, great airplane question for me. And if any of you ever get sitting next to me on an airplane, now you'll have the answer or know what I'm going to ask. But many times I'm sitting next to folks, and they'll talk about their lives, or they'll talk about their history, and inevitably, whenever we talk about who we are, it always comes up about what we do in our life, the work that we do, right? Because we're so closely identified with that. That's wonderful. It has a lot to do with what we value and who we are. But I'll ask, so you've given me a wonderful history of who you are. You've given me a wonderful history of the events in your life. What's your legacy as a leader? What's the legacy that you're creating? And again, it doesn't matter if you're a mother or father, or you've been a senior executive in an organization for 20, 30 years. You have a legacy. Whether you are creating it or not, it is being created for you. So how do you go about authoring your legacy? What does that look like? And again, that starts with, why do you choose to lead? And the essence of finding your voice. But if you really think about legacy, what's the legacy that you are creating for yourself as a leader? When you look at the voice model right here on the left side, we've got, what are the values that are important to you? What are the outcomes you want to have? What's that influence, that demonstrating that influence of who you are as a leader? How do you exercise that courage, stepping out of your CZ? CZ stands for comfort zone. We've all got comfort zones. Comfort zones are comfortable. How do you demonstrate your courage as a leader? And then finally, wrapping it all up around who you are as a leader, your brand, your overall expression. So this is the model I created as an executive coach in terms of demonstrating those values, those outcomes, that influence, that courage and expression. What is your voice as a leader? So let's kind of start this little roadmap and this journey and begin our values. So this will be the next slide, slide number 4. We talk about values. Now there's a lot that goes into values. And if you think about values in today's world, we hear the word values all the time. Political values, faith values, corporate values, team values, individual values. Values are thrown out all the time. But when I ask leaders, what do you value? What are your core values as a leader? Again, many times it's not a question that some executives, some leaders have actually thought of. In fact, I was with a new client the other day, and I have permission to use this example, although my clients will be anonymous, but I was with a new client the other day, and I asked this executive, I said, what are your top 2 or 3 values as a leader? You've been a leader for 25 years, wonderful history, you've built up an incredible resume. What are your 2 or 3 values as a leader? And the way that this client looked at me and just sort of like had sort of like the wheels were all going around in here. And then the words came out around teamwork, and the words came out around collaboration, and the words came out around feedback. And I thought, gosh, those values sound really similar to the values that are up on your wall or on the little laminated card, which are your corporate values as an organization. And I'm not saying that that's sure. Those are the really intrinsic values that really drove this particular leader. And I can tell you a little bit later on that it wasn't. In fact, the values of the organization that he just exemplified, or he actually just espoused to me, were not at all values that he had as a leader. Thus, they were kind of incongruent. And thus, there was a reason why he was disengaged at the organization. So when you think about values, we go through many exercises as a coach, or as a coach, I take my clients through exercises in terms of how do you really determine your values? Am I confident in what I believe? You know, what is it that I believe to be true as a leader, as a person in my community, as a parent, whatever the role is, am I what I do believe? Am I aware at the wheel? And what I mean by that is that many times we speak in the United States. Sometimes we use a kind of an expression like, "Are you awake at the wheel?" Because you want to be definitely awake at the wheel, and when you're driving a car. I like to use the term, "Are you aware at the wheel?" Because many times we can drive a car and we can go 50 miles or 40 kilometers, and then all of a sudden we're like, "How did I get here? Did I just drive on autopilot?" And that is, are we really aware of who we are? Are we aware at our wheel of who we are and what we believe in and what our values are? Or are we on autopilot with the values of the organization that I happen to be at in the moment? Those, again, very, very, very clear definition. And then lastly, and these are just some of the questions I asked, these are that I've included here on the slide, am I clear with my purpose? What's my purpose? And again, having a purpose in terms of what I'm doing, having a clear purpose with a clear outcome, which I mentioned earlier on at the start of our conversation today, having a clear purpose of why are you doing what you're doing right now? Why are you on this webinar? What's the purpose of this webinar? What do you want to get out of it? How clear are you with that purpose? And again, these are questions amongst other questions that are also part of the book that I ask my clients on an and by the way, I ask myself on an ongoing basis. It's how I get clarity around what I value. It's how I get clarity around framing that. So again, if we could go to slide 5 to kind of sum up sort of the values, what is your value kind of triangle or trifecta? That's what I always ask. Hashtag lead out front. And what I mean by lead out front, you lead out front with your values so people know what you believe in. People know what you stand for. People understand that. There is so much going on in the world nowadays where we hide behind things and we don't always know what people stand for. I want to have a leader. I want to know a leader that is going to stand for something. I can then agree or disagree with that leader, certainly, but I want to know what that leader stands for. And the trifecta here, or the triangle, I always use as a model with my clients to say, give me your 3 points, your 3 top values, and that's going to start our discussion around what you value as a leader. So the triangle becomes a very, very key symbol of where you begin thinking about what are those top 3 values. Because again, values can be a whole litany and list of things. I like to start very simple. What are your top 3? And why are those the top 3 for you? And are those congruent with the rest of your life? And especially, are those congruent with where you are as an organization? Because one of the key aspects of disengagement in an organization is that the values are not aligned. That people are working in an organization where their personal values, their leadership values, their GPS of who they are not aligned to the rest of the organization. So that's a little synopsis of kind of values. Let's now move on to, once you've identified your values, you go to your outcomes. And you establish your outcomes in terms of who you are as a leader. That's the second part of finding your voice. So slide number 6. Slide number 6 gives us sort of the outcomes I have. So think about for a second. Think about this for okay, seconds up. As a leader, am I charting a roadmap for your vision or for my vision? Am I charting that roadmap? Am I creating that vision? We all probably have known leaders who don't necessarily have a vision, that don't necessarily set goals, that don't necessarily have a direction. So constantly you should be asking, a roadmap for my vision. Am I keeping my IO scale in balance? Now, what's IO? What is that IO? And this is one of my favorite things that I work with leaders on. How many times have you heard somebody say, I had the best of intent? I had the best intention. I meant to do that. Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, Paul. I really thought I was going to do that. I really wanted to do that. That's what we call having the best of intention. Well, we can just fool ourselves up with a bunch of intentions. But if we don't follow those intentions up with outcomes, then our IO scale is out of balance. And I work with my clients on this all the time, especially in the corporate world, where they might have the best of intent, but that doesn't result in an action. It doesn't have the results that they're looking for. It doesn't have it doesn't end up with, the specific outcomes that are tied to that intention. So in other words, IO scale is very, very key. Your IO scale should always be in balance. If you have an intention, it should be followed with an outcome. If you find yourself with a lot of that heavy I, you're full of intention, then you need to kind of create much more of a balance. So I always ask, how is your IO scale doing this week? And let's go through the week and look at that from a standpoint of your intention to outcome. And then, of course, how obvious is the direction that I am going as a leader? Because as a leader, people are going to follow you. People want to follow you. People are going to look to you, and they want to have discussions with you. They want to know what, again, going back to your values, what you stand for. So are you obvious in the direction that you're going? Or are you all over the place? Are you completely chaotic? Are you completely scattered? And people don't know where you're going. You change your mind all the time, and you don't do it in a very deliberate way so people can understand and connect the dots. So, and again, with outcomes, it's very, very clear that you set your roadmap for your vision, that you keep your intention balanced with your outcomes, and that you're very obvious with the direction that you are going. You can certainly change your mind. You can certainly change directions. In fact, one of the hallmarks of a great leader is be able to be adaptable and resilient, but you want to be obvious in the direction that you're going so your organization, your team, the folks that you work with, your community, wherever it is that you are leading, understand the direction that you're going. Think about this down to the home level. As a parent, how obvious are you in the direction that you take as a parent with your family, with your children? It's the same, it has the same type of attributes and the same meaning no matter where you are as a leader. So let's now go on. So we've got our values. Your outcomes should be aligned to your value, your decisions. Now we go to how do you influence, which is slide number 7. Or excuse me, before we do that, real quickly on outcomes. Whoops, slide number 7, lead with clarity. So again, this is hashtag lead with clarity. Lead with clarity is around having that clear vision. You are clear where you're going. It could be today, it could be this week, it could be this month, or it could be for your overall strategy for the year or 2 years, depending on what you set up. But you lead with clarity, and people know where you're going, and people understand where you're going, and they understand why you're going there. So now we'll go on to our influence. And influence is key. So slide number 8, we talk about influence. Influence is are you someone that people want to follow? Am I a leader that people want to follow? So people follow leaders all the time, all over the place. Sometimes they have to follow their leader, quote unquote, because they report to that particular leader. That's not necessarily using your influence. That's using the org chart because people have to follow you. Or that's using the dynamics of the relationship that you might be in as a husband or wife, boyfriend, girlfriend, parent and child, whatever that might be. You're using that relationship. But are you really influencing who you are? Are you establishing that trust and credibility in the relationships that people then want to follow you and are influenced by you? Are you a connector of relationships? And a connector is somebody, not necessarily a networker, and I don't want that to get confused here. A networker is somebody who kind of goes out and kind of can meet lots of people and network really well. We all know those kind of folks. As an introvert myself, I'm an introvert. The networkers are people that like, wow, I tend to stay home with a cat on my stomach watching TV to kind of replenish my energy. The extroverts are out there networking. A connector is a little bit different. A connector is somebody who sees the relationships between people, who sees the relationships between process, who sees the relationships between strategy, and can connect it for others. So don't get connector confused with networker, but a connector of relationships. Sometimes those relationships might be people, sometimes they might be process, sometimes they might be things that go on in the world, and we can kind of connect those and create sort of that connection for people. That is key to influencing. When you can do that as a leader, when you can help connect those relationships, whether they be, again, people, process, events, activities, whatever that might be, you are influencing. And then bringing in that trust and credibility that I talked about, walking the talk. And this, we've heard this a lot. Am I walking the talk? Am I actually doing what I'm saying I'm going to be doing? Because that's going to establish who I am as a trusting leader and as a credible leader, which are the hallmarks of influence. In order to be influential, you want to be trusting. You want to be credible. It's not about, am I liked? Am I popular? Do I want to be liked? I made the biggest mistake. I mean, by the way, folks, you're looking right here, this person right here with the short hair and the little tie on, talking to you right now. I've made every mistake there is to make as a manager and as a leader. I've done it. And the key is, how many times have I made those mistakes over again? And have I learned from those mistakes? And I can say in my 30-plus career, I have absolutely learned from the mistakes. Some of them are very difficult. Some of them are mistakes that can hurt. You can be discouraged and disappointed, as we all are in our life. But do you learn from those mistakes? And the reason I'm talking about that is, am I walking the talk? Am I somebody that people want to follow? Am I a connector of relationships? This does not necessarily happen overnight in terms of influence, because in today's society, if you think about social media and you think about the way we all connect with each other, it is around, do you like this? How many followers do you have? How many connections do you have? So as a manager or leader, do people like you? Wrong question to ask, as we know. Influence is not about like, it's about trust and credibility. Slide number 9 kind of brings this home. When you look at your sphere of influence, do you lead with TLC? And we can use TLC for lots of different things. A lot of times I think, we need a lot of TLC, whether we call that tender loving care, but what I'm calling it right now, and lasting credibility. And I use the term lasting, or the word lasting, because you want it to be sustainable. You're not just credible for the moment. You're not just trusting for the moment. You're not just trusting for the day. You want to be trusting and have lasting credibility over the life of your role as a leader. And that's what you want to build in terms of your brand and how you go about that. So it's not just being credible in the second. It's about being credible for the lifetime that you're a leader. So that tells you, so right now, here's where we are with voice. We had our values, who are you? What's important to you? Then we establish the outcomes, the goals, the vision, what we want for ourselves, our team, our organization, that are aligned to the values we have as a leader. Then we go about, how do we influence that? How do we take all of that and start to build those relationships, which are key? And so you've got values, outcomes, and influence. Now we come to, how do I demonstrate my courage, which is slide number 10. Wonderful. Thank you, Laurie. You're doing a stupendous job with the slides, by the way. I really appreciate that. So courage. Now, I'm going to say one thing. This can be very difficult, and there's always a lot of talk around courageous. Are you a courageous leader? I'm not quite sure always what that means. Because it's so individual, right? Everyone's got their own comfort zone. Comfort zones are defined. We define our own comfort zone over the course of our lifetime, based on what happens to us, based on how we react. Some folks today, as we talked about, are certainly out of their comfort zone. Some folks might be well within their comfort zone based on the events today in terms of the election and things that we're dealing with. So everyone's got a different comfort zone that you define. The key is, as a leader, when do you stand up for what you believe? How many times do you actually stand up and state your opinion, or raise that hand and ask that question, or just stand up so people understand what you believe? I can't tell you how many times in organizations I see leaders not doing that because they feel, well, you know what, I don't want to rock the boat. I'm just going to go along with the norm. I just don't, put myself out there. I hear that a lot. I don't want to put myself out there. How many times have you heard that? I don't want to put myself out there. Think about what out there is. Out there is outside of your comfort zone. That may not be what they're thinking about, but that's what it's referring to. How many times do I want to put myself out there? Because that means out there is uncomfortableness. Out there is, whoa, I'm too exposed. So demonstrating your courage where relevant and where applicable. How are you okay to stand alone? So when have you ever stood alone with your opinions? When have you ever had to stand alone with what you believe in? That takes a lot of courage. It may not be the same as jumping off and out of an airplane, as I'm sure some of our colleagues do, but it takes a lot of courage as a leader to do something that might be a little bit different than what the norm is. And then the last one I talk about, by the way, this all comes out of my book where I have a list of these things that I use in terms of coaching. But am I redefining my CZ? And that means, obviously, am I redefining my comfort zone? How do I redefine this? And again, this is not about pushing people out of their comfort zone just to do it. A lot of times we might do something in the spur, like, wow, that was great, but I don't want to do that again. Riding a roller coaster or doing something that's like maybe stepping out of our comfort zone. Public speaking is something that people feel might be stepping out of their comfort zone. But more importantly, as a leader, one of the things I do as a coach is defining that comfort zone for that particular leader, and then how do you redefine it where the situation might warrant it. It doesn't mean every day you're going to be stepping out of it. It doesn't mean every day you're going to be having that feeling in your stomach when you know you're stepping out of that comfort zone. But how do you redefine your comfort zone on a fairly consistent basis? Because by redefining your comfort zone and stepping out of it, that's how you grow as an individual. That's how we grow as humans. That's how we evolve. If you think about it, think about all the things that have happened in your choice or not by choice. It's how we integrate those. It's how we react to those events. And those, a lot of times, we are redefining the comfort zone. So courage has a lot to do from a leadership standpoint of what do I need to do to step out of that. And so slide number 11 kind of sums it up for us, because when you're really courageous, you're leading with confidence. You're confident of who you are. You're confident of, yeah, this is where I'm at today. This is where we're going. These are my values. I have the courage to kind of speak up and state that. It's all around having that confidence as a leader. So it's lead with confidence. Hashtag lead with confidence. So this is not the easiest part. Stepping out of your comfort zone, having that courage to do things differently, that certainly takes a very deliberate action to do. And when I work with the organizations, including myself, that's just with a bit of time to work on. It's not as easy. It's easy to put this on a slide like this, but I know it's not always easy to actually apply this in our life. The last of the voice on slide number 12 is crafting your overall expression. And this is sort of thinking about the values of who you are as a leader, the outcomes of who you are and what you've established as a leader, how you go about influencing those outcomes, that vision with your values. What do you need to do to step out of that comfort zone and demonstrate that courage? And then more importantly now, how do you wrap it all up in an overall brand as a leader? What do you stand for? Are you creating your desired impact? In other words, and that's assuming that you understand the impact, the legacy, going back to our first question, that you want to have as a leader. So am I creating my desired impact? And more importantly, how do I know that? Am I conveying an authentic brand? I talk a lot about, in my coaching, I talk a lot about creating your leadership brand. Because if you really think about brands, you think about sort of the products that have brands, everyone has a brand of leadership. We have a style of leadership. We have a philosophy of leadership. So we certainly have a leadership brand. And it comes from our values. It comes from our vision. It comes from our relationships, our influence. It comes from our courage of who we are and how we stand up or stand alone or stand aside and release that ego. So our brand is who we are, but is it authentic to who we are as well? And then, am I practicing intentional communication? This goes back to what I talked about at the very beginning with Becky regarding everything that goes on in today's world, especially today, and especially how we get bombarded with all social media, communication, the emails, the voicemails, I think people still get voicemails, all the dialogue that we have with folks. Are you with your communication? So are you very deliberate with what you're going to say? And are you really thinking it through? Or are you just reacting so fast because you have to reply to those emails in such a way that you're almost on autopilot when you're reacting? It's an exercise that I take leaders through in terms, how do you practice intentional communication? And is it creating the brand that you want as a leader? Is it creating the legacy that you want as a leader? And thus, is it crafting that overall expression of who you are as a leader, that authentic leader that comes from within? So slide number 13 is hashtag lead deliberately. So when you think about your overall expression, whether it be your facial expressions as I'm using here with this slide, or whether it be just your overall presence, whether you're in person, whether you're in a virtual environment, whether you're in academia, nonprofit, for-profit, family, relationships, no matter where you are you leading deliberately with those relationships? Are you leading deliberately as a leader? Those are absolutely key. And many times in roles that we have, especially in organizations, we are going so fast and the environment is dictating that it almost is, we are in such reactive mode that we don't take that time to really be deliberate with who we are as a leader. And I can tell you right away, going, in terms of myself, there's been many times, certainly in the past, not right now, hopefully, but certainly in the past when I haven't led that way. I've been very reactive, or my motivation has been questioned in terms of why am I doing what I'm doing, and I wasn't clear on my direction, I wasn't clear on my outcomes, and that shows up. We deal with those people all the time. We see that all the time in our life. We can tell when people have a clear vision, when what they value, when they're courageous enough, and then their overall brand. So this gives you sort of a synopsis of what the voice is and how you find your voice as a leader. If we can go to slide 14. So what is your voice? I come back to that question all the time. The wonderful pictures on here are the people that gave me my voice. When I think about who I am as a leader, I think about my wonderful mother, and my wonderful late sister, and my wonderful late brother, and my wonderful father there. And I look at my father, and the epiphany that I had in terms of how I developed the Find Your Voice as a Leader piece was, it was June 2009, and I was sitting in a church listening to people talk about what a wonderful man my father was. And it was his memorial service, and he had a wonderful life. And I'm sitting there listening to people talk about who he was and what he meant to them in their lives, in their careers, and so forth. And I just sat there and I thought, wow, what are they going to say about me? What's going to be my legacy? What's going to be my message? What difference am I making in the world today that I want to make? Am I in the right role? Am I in the right place where I want to be? It was such a wonderful gift. My sister said at the time that it was a wonderful sort of final mentoring of my father to me to say, Paul, if you're not doing what you should be doing, get out and find what you need to do. And I think that happens a lot of times in our lives when we go through certain rites of passage. And what I did is I took a very deliberate approach to really going out and seeking what I wanted to do, and then building a framework around that in terms of sort of a new business, a new passion, and a new message. So it was this wonderful sort of event in terms of the transition of my father that really brought it home to me. And I look at these folks that have created my voice for me. My sister, who has since passed on, my little brother, who passed on early on, and certainly my loving mother, who was always there for me like an anchor, and who would always give me sort of those snippets of advice that still come back today. And that's my whole point around finding your voice. You never know the difference your voice is going to make. You never know when somebody is going to think about what you said and use that in their life and that impact. You may never know that. You may never get that feedback. We go through our lives and we don't always have that opportunity to provide that feedback. So that's the key here is understanding what is your voice, and especially as a leader, how do you use that voice for the impact that you want to have, for the positive in the world, whether it be for your organization, your team, and more importantly, your community and yourself. And that kind of in a synopsis is how you find your voice as a leader in that way. So next slide, please. And now we have our call to action. So Becky, oh, there we are. I get to see you again. That's wonderful.
Wow, I don't know about you guys, but I'm really inspired by the thinking that we've covered so far. And I think we're actually going to wait on the call to action until after the question and answer time. So now is the time to share some questions if you have them. There are a few that are here that I'll start with.
I just have to find your voice, Becky. Find your voice.
I found it. I found my voice.
That was all planned, by the way, everybody. That was planned. That was planned.
Of course it was. Of course it was. So I think we're all good now. So Neil is wondering if you can give him some insight into how he can become the leader to work with his prospective clients who are he's a creativity coach, helping small and mid-sized businesses become creative and consulting employees to overcome their fear of creativity and regain confidence in the creative process. So he's wondering if you can give him some insight into how he can become the leader to work with those people.
Yeah, the first thing that comes to mind, thank you, Neil, for that question. The first thing that comes to mind is, how did you do that? So when you ask that question in terms of getting people over that resistance or getting them over that fear, the key is, especially as a coach, how did you do that? What were the lessons that you have learned? What were the things that have you done, whether they be in your organization or your life, and then create that story for yourself around that. That's what I do as a coach. So case in point, for me, my coaching audience is obviously a little bit different. But when I look at leaders, or I look at managers, or I look at people that I create in terms of my clients, I look at what I've gone through of my experience. I look at those lessons. What have I learned? The successes, the failures, and so forth and so on. So the very key thing for you is to really look to see that story, that content that you have, that you've used to get folks over that, and then create a model. So the first part is create your content around your story, right, and how you did it, which are your lessons. Then create your model. And the model doesn't have to be a huge framework. The model doesn't have to be like a huge thesis. The model is, what are the three things I did? What are those three things that I would have somebody do? The next 3 steps, the 3 points of a triangle. I always work with leaders on that myself. So when I talk to leaders myself around what's your leadership brand, your voice, your philosophy, and they're like, I don't have no idea what that is, I work with them on creating their own leadership model. And so these executives who I work with, they have such great experience, but they've never thought about, wow, I actually have a model of leadership that I can apply to my team and my organization. So what you want to do, Neil, is as a coach, certainly, there's tons of models out there, and we can use them back and forth. And I use lots of resources and lots of wonderful models from a coaching perspective, but create your own uniqueness around what that model would look like for you. And that has to come from your own experience. So that would be my very...
Great. So we have quite a few more questions coming in, and I love this one that came from Christine. It's a question I want to figure out for myself. She asks, how do you catch yourself when you're quite where you aspire it to be? And maybe remind, in case there are some people who came late and didn't hear IO, maybe remind what that stands for.
Sure. That's a great question, Christine. And how do you catch yourself? So a couple things. IO is that IO scale. The IO is are your intentions aligned with your outcome? Your IO scale should always be in balance. And Christine asked sort of the proverbial kind of great question and the zing question in a way. How do you catch yourself? That first level of catch has to be that self-awareness to be able to catch yourself, right? You have to be aware that you have the intentions and that you have the outcome and that they might be out of balance or in balance before you can even catch yourself. So that's the very first step, and I'll borrow a term that a lot of us are familiar with from emotional intelligence, Goldman's term that has been out there for so long. That first level of emotional intelligence, or that first step, is self-awareness and being self-aware. What the exercise I go through with some of my clients in aspects, or sometimes with teams as well, because teams get their IO scales out of balance. Project teams, product development teams, they don't always have their scales in balance, is we list all the intentions that they've had, that they've stated, that they've espoused, and then we create the outcomes out of that to see. And what have you got? If you got a list of 12 intentions that you've had over the last 2 weeks, and you've got maybe 3 or 4 outcomes, there you go right there. It's out of balance. You can tell a story around that. There could be reasons why you have 14 intentions and 4 outcomes, but you better be able to align those at some point. That's the very first step. The more awareness you bring to that, the more you'll understand what it feels like. Because Christine used a feeling kind of word. How do you catch yourself? How do you know that? You'll begin to understand like, oh, it is really, really out of balance.
Thanks so much. This next question is from Kevin, and he's wondering, Paul, if you can talk more about your process on intentional communications in terms of getting your voice out there.
Yeah, that's a great question. So intentional communications is one of those things, any kind of intention, but intentional communications is, what do you want to say? When do you want to say it? How do you want to say it? And what's the outcome you want to have? In the corporate vernacular and in the corporate best practices, those of us that come from organizations, a lot of times it's called a communication plan. We have this whole big thesis of how we're going to communicate everything, and we have to do that because we want it to be very methodical. We want it to be very strategic. But when I talk to leaders around intentional communication, we actually go through an exercise of what's the communication you want to have with whatever audience that is, and how do you want to have it, and what's the outcome you're looking for. Many times that outcome piece, Kevin, is left off. We think about, oh, I'm going to say this, I'm going to say it at this time, I'm going to use this modality, etc. And then we have to think about what's the outcome we want to have with that audience, whether it be an audience of 1, whether it be an audience of thousands. What's the outcome you want to have? And then we back up from that. We start with that outcome, back up from that to see, is everything else aligned to that? And it can be a very, very simple exercise to think about any kind of communication you have. And I sometimes do it with my friends. So sometimes, instead of looking at it from a standpoint, it always has to be a large group. You might want to have a communication piece with your friend around something. What's the outcome you want to have? What do you want to influence them on? And how do you back up from that? And it could be something as simple as, where are you going to go for dinner? Where are you going to go out tonight? What movie are you going to go see? What are you going to go stream from Hulu? What are those things? It could be something simple like that. The outcome is, I want to influence this, and you back up with, how do I communicate that? Those are great exercises in which to use, but it's a very step-by-step process in which to do it. But it really is quite simple once you kind of think it through. The thing is, from an intentional communication standpoint, we don't think that through. Intentional and communication usually don't go hand in hand.
That's really helpful, Paul. Thank you. So my friend John, maybe he's my friend, I'm not sure, has a couple of comments here, and referencing the leadership of his company, who's assigned some numerous inspirational books for managers to read with little result. He wants to know, what's the best process to make a group actually develop vision and work, and how do you get people to actually implement and execute on that vision?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, so well, there are a few other comments here, but let's start with that.
So regarding the book piece and John's piece around the books, if the books aren't working, there's a reason why, right? There's a reason why, you know, either the messaging is not compelling enough or people aren't necessarily understanding how to put all of that in action. But what I do when I'm in, whether it be teams or leaders and so forth and so on, you start with, I don't assume that everyone understands exactly how to get to the vision or understands what that end result is. So you start with sort of thinking around the education around that. And you can use a lot of different techniques. One of my favorite techniques, because I work with a lot of tech companies, I work with a lot of social media companies, I work with a lot of digital tech, is I get them out of the wording. You know, so I get them out of the linear spreadsheets, algorithms, and so forth and so on, which usually comes from engineering protocol, and I get them thinking all from a graphical piece, and I get them thinking around visuals, and I get them people kind of actually creating a visual, i.e., a work of art, a drawing, whatever that might be, what that vision would look like. Everyone usually has an understanding of where we are today, the current environment, the strengths, the weaknesses of where we are. And then from that, you can usually get to where do we need to be based on our strategy, based on our business, based on everything. And what you try to do is your whole is filling that gap in. But before you can even talk about the gap, you need to be able to understand how do people, what is that end vision for people? So when I work with teams, especially leaders, you come up with they each create their own artwork or their piece of art around what that vision looks like. You bring that back to the group, and you can see where there's definitely correlation, and you can see where there's a lot of differences. And you bring that out from the group, from that perspective. And because people have had to use a different part of their head, like I have to do sometimes, you actually get a lot of great discussion versus just words or adjectives that we tend to write on flip charts sometimes. So the vision piece is very, very key if you do want a collaborative effort around vision. And I say that because there are leaders that I've worked with that actually don't want a collaborative effort around vision. They want their vision to be implemented, which is okay. That's fine. I'm not judging that. But be very clear that if you want a collaborative effort on vision, you want to then make sure that you are modeling that versus I have a vision and I just want people to follow. And be very, again, that goes back to who you are as a leader and that authenticity. Because I've worked with both, and sometimes there's an incongruency when a leader says, I want to be collaborative, but they really don't want to be collaborative. And in this case, what John was saying, I think it's like, it is definitely collaborative, but sometimes you have leaders who's like, no, I don't really want to be collaborative. That's fine. Then let your vision and how you influence that.
So what about the implementation piece, Paul? So there, you have a vision that you've achieved collaboratively, and what happens when there's a gap between the vision that exists and then people implementing or executing that vision?
Yeah, so that comes down to, that's the old A word of accountability. So that comes back to what deliberate steps are you taking? And this is where companies get caught. And I've worked in large companies, small companies, mid-sized companies, so I get it. And they come out with these big action plans. They come out with these huge action plans around how we're going to implement our vision, how we're going to implement our mission, how we're going to implement our our strategy, how we're going to do all of those things. And it's like, for Pete's sake, it's not a thesis. What are the next 3 steps that you need to take in order to get there? Then what are the next 3 steps you need to take in order to get there? Then what are the next 3 steps you need to take? And before you know it, you have built up momentum. I use 3s a lot. We use, I've learned that in my coaching that 3 is a great number for people. It's not just 1 or 2, but it's not 4 or 5. 3 is a great number in terms of the steps that we can take as leaders, as individuals, and as teams in order to do the next piece. A lot of times we get stuck because it's almost overwhelming what we have to get done and when we have to do it. And so then nothing gets done. This happens all the time in organizations when they do engagement surveys and they get all that feedback back. And then the next year there's been no action on it and the engagement survey comes out and the people say, well, there's been no action on it. It's because sometimes there's just so much to do. You have to deconstruct it and break it up in chunks. And you need to do what are the next 3 things, the next 3 steps. And that's what I work with when you work with teams on that. You work with them on that, and then you hold that accountability circle or that accountability team accountable. in terms of what that will look like going forward. So it's not just a it's not just a bunch of like getting together and having some fun and then going off and then nothing happens. There are actual tangible steps that have to take place in terms of the implementation of that vision.
Great. Thank you so much. I think we're out of time, which makes me a little bit sad, but I do have some fun news to share and a few calls to action, as you mentioned earlier. So the first thing is that I encourage all of you to go out today and buy Paul's great new book, Find Your Voice as a Leader, either in print or on Kindle. And that link to buy the book will be in my follow-up email, or you can just search on Amazon or your other favorite online booksellers to find your voice as a leader. So that would be the first call to action. The second one would be if you are someone who hires speakers either for keynotes or for breakouts, and you like what you've seen from Paul, I ask that you might consider reaching out to him for your next event. Although I know Paul is a world traveler, he's got a speaking gig coming up just in about 10 days or so in the Philippines, which is really exciting. So if you want to see him on your stage, definitely get in touch with Paul, and you can reach him, Paul, at paulandlarsen.com. Additionally, if you are looking for an executive coach for the leaders in your organization or for a team in your organization, Paul and I had a conversation just yesterday in which he was explaining to me how coaching a team works and what it's like when you bring a group of executives together and the way that can challenge them in their leadership and their contributions. And that's the kind of work that he does with leaders at SAP and Kaiser Permanente, and really sounds interesting and valuable. So if you're interested in finding out about executive coaching or team coaching, you can also reach out to Paul about that as well. So thank you so much for investing this hour. I have so many things to think about, and most notably that whole balance between intention and outcome is one that I struggle with on a daily basis. Oh my goodness. So thank you for all the insight you shared with us today, Paul.
It's been a pleasure. This is such an honor, and I really just appreciate everybody's time, their dedication. Becky, your team, I just appreciate the wonderfulness and the support and the advocacy. And again, just an honor to spend this today. And I hope I make some connections out of people going forward. Don't hesitate to shoot me an email, ask me questions. I'm available. I love sort of passing on this message. It's what I was meant to do, and I just love to do it.
Well, and I forgot, there are a few people already dropping off. If you are still listening to my voice and you're interested in winning one of 5 free copies of this book today, email your feedback about this event, what you enjoyed, what you learned to me, Becky at weavinginfluence.com. From the people who send me feedback, we'll select 5 winners and get that book out to you. So I forgot to mention that earlier. So if you hung around, it's a good thing. And have a great day, everyone.
Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.